There is a continent at the bottom of the world that no one is allowed to freely explore. 50 nations. 50 have agreed on this. And if you think about how rarely 50 nations agree on anything, that single fact should keep you awake tonight. But we'll get there. First, I need to take you somewhere else. I need to take you to a number, a year, 1820. Sit with that date for a moment. Let it settle. Because by the end of this, it will feel less like a historical footnote and more like a locked door. For most of my life, that number meant nothing to me. Antarctica, discovered in 1820. I absorbed it in a classroom the way you absorb the colour of the walls. It was background, furniture, something that simply was. I never thought to push against it. I never wondered why that year, and not another. And then, slowly at first, then all at once, I started paying attention to what surrounded that date. The years before it, the silence after it, the shape of what was missing. And once I saw it, the entire timeline cracked open. If you watched the previous episode in this series, and I'll leave the link below because what I'm about to walk through rests on that foundation. You already know where this begins. You already know about 1816, the year the sky went dark. Official history frames it neatly. Mount Tambora erupts in Indonesia, 1815. Volcanic ash blankets the atmosphere. Temperatures plummet across the northern hemisphere. Crops die. Livestock collapse. Snow falls in June across New England and northern Europe. Famine grips entire nations. They call it the year without a summer, and they attribute it to a single volcanic event on the other side of the world. Clean, contained, explained. Except it isn't. Not when you look closely. The devastation wasn't regional, it was planetary. Reports of blood-red sunsets and unnatural cold didn't cluster around Southeast Asia. They appeared simultaneously on every inhabited continent. And the aftermath wasn't merely environmental. In the years that followed, communities fractured, populations displaced. Institutional memory shattered so completely that entire settlements appeared to lose all connection with whatever had come before them. One researcher I encountered described it as a kind of civilizational amnesia, whole regions starting over with no thread leading backward. In that earlier video, I put forward a proposition that made many of you uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort is the first sign that the frame is shifting. The proposition was this: the atmospheric catastrophe of 1816 may not have been volcanic alone. Its signature, the totality of it, the global simultaneity, the depth and duration of the darkness, resembles something far more violent than a single eruption. It resembles, in its characteristics, what modern science would classify as nuclear winter. Not from a weapon in the modern sense, from something civilization ending, a reset, the kind of event that doesn't just alter climate, it erases memory. And this is where the thread leads somewhere most people won't follow. Because if the world before 1816 was not the world we've been taught, if there existed, prior to that rupture, a global civilization of extraordinary sophistication, one whose architecture and infrastructure and geographic knowledge we are still stumbling across in the historical record, then the question isn't just what happened. The question is what was lost. Throughout this series on the Tartarian archive, we've been tracing that ghost, not an empire with borders on a modern map. Something more diffuse and more unsettling, a presence woven into stonework and canal systems and city plans that appear fully formed in the record with no documentation of their construction, no scaffolding period, no messy, incremental archaeology of trial and error. Just there. Complete, as if someone built the world and then vanished from it. And then, 4 years after the sky cleared, Antarctica enters the historical record. Hold that interval in your mind. Do not let it go. 4 years, not a generation, not an epoch. 4 years after what may have been the most devastating atmospheric event in recorded human memory. An event that, if the analysis holds, functioned as the death rattle of an entire global order, the most remote, most inaccessible, most impenetrable landmass on the planet is suddenly, officially found. And here is the detail that stops me cold every time I return to it. Not by one expedition, by three: British, American, Russian, all operating independently, we are told. All in the same waters, all within months of one another, all in 1820. Coincidence is a word that does a lot of heavy lifting in mainstream history. I want to set it down for a moment and ask a different question. Not whether it happened. Clearly it did. But why then, after thousands of years of maritime civilization, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Chinese, the Polynesians, every great seafaring culture that ever guided a vessel by starlight across open ocean? After all of that, the largest landmass south of the equator remains entirely unknown, entirely uncharted, entirely unnamed, until 4 years after the world went dark. Why? Because the closer I examined the cartographic evidence, the more the official discovery date began to dissolve. The Piri Reis map, 1513, drawn by an Ottoman admiral who stated explicitly that he compiled his chart from much older source maps, sources he never identified, sources that have never been found. That map depicts a southern landmass with coastal details so precise that 20th century researchers, overlaying it against satellite imagery of Antarctica's subglacial terrain, the actual rock formation beneath 2 miles of ice, found alignment that no one has satisfactorily explained to this day. Then there is the Oronteus Finaeus map, 1531. It goes further. It shows Antarctica without ice, river systems, mountain ranges, internal geographic features that humanity did not independently confirm until the 1950s, using sonar technology that did not exist when that map was drawn. Let that land. A map from 1531 depicts physical characteristics of a continent that we could not verify through our own technology for another 400 years. The standard academic response is familiar coincidence, philosophical speculation, geometric symmetry, ancient mapmakers guessing that a southern continent must exist to balance the north. Perhaps, but guessing doesn't produce river systems. Speculation doesn't generate subglacial ridgelines. You don't hypothesize a coastline with enough precision that it survives 5 centuries of scrutiny against satellite data. That kind of detail comes from mere observation, from presence, from someone who either stood on that ground or inherited knowledge from someone who did. Which raises the question the official record has never adequately answered. Who was there? If you're finding value in this, take a moment to subscribe to Tartarian Archive or consider becoming a YouTube member. This series ventures into territory that most channels leave alone, and your presence here genuinely matters. Now, back to the ice. We are far from finished. I want to revisit 1816 from a different angle. In the previous episode, I framed the atmospheric event as an ending, the terminal moment of a pre-existing global order, the final collapse. And I believe that framing is correct, but I've come to suspect it may also be incomplete. What if 1816 was not only a destruction? What if it was also, for certain forces, an opportunity? Here is the pattern I cannot stop circling. Whatever generated the atmospheric blackout of 1816, whatever its true origin, it was powerful enough to disrupt climate across the entire northern hemisphere for over a year. What if that same mechanism was also capable of accelerating glaciation at the poles? What if the ice-free continent depicted on 16th century maps was, at that very moment, in the process of freezing, or had recently frozen, and 1816 was either the final stage of that process, or a violent acceleration of it? I present this not as a conclusion. I present it as a shape, a convergence of timing, geography, and institutional silence that refuses to resolve into coincidence. Watch the sequence. 1816, the sky goes black. Civilization reels. 1820, Antarctica is officially discovered, catalogued, named, claimed, not before the darkness, not during it, after, 4 years after. The rhythm of that sequence, once you hear it, becomes impossible to unhear. And it does not stop there. 1938. 7 years before the end of World War II, Nazi Germany dispatches an expedition to Antarctica, the Schwabenland expedition. They survey nearly 600,000 square kilometers, plant thousands of territorial markers, and reportedly return with something that redirected priorities at the highest levels of the Reich's scientific apparatus. What exactly? The records thin out in precisely the way records thin out when the content matters. What is documented is that German U-boats operated in Antarctic waters as late as 1945, and that senior figures within the Nazi scientific elite harbored a well-documented obsession with ancient knowledge, lost civilizations, and inherited cartographic traditions predating the modern era. The same maps, the same thread. Then 1946, 1 year after the war ends. The United States Navy launches Operation High Jump, not a quiet research excursion. 13 warships, 33 aircraft, nearly 5,000 military personnel, commanded by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, one of the most decorated officers in American naval history. The official purpose was scientific survey and base establishment. Perhaps that is all it was. But the timing makes the hairs on your neck stand up, because the Americans were not the first military power drawn to that ice. They were following a trail that someone else had already walked. And all of them, the Ottoman admiral with his ancient source maps, the German expedition with its classified findings, the American military with its full naval deployment, all of them converged on the same destination. The same frozen continent that appeared on charts centuries before anyone supposedly knew it existed. Who maintained that knowledge? Whose hands passed those maps across the centuries, across the 1816 rupture, intact enough for multiple parties, separated by language, ideology, and war, to follow them to the same coordinates? The chain of custody is invisible, and its invisibility is, itself, a kind of evidence. Now, I want to address what most discussions of Antarctica deliberately avoid, because I believe it is the most revealing detail of all. You cannot freely go there. Let me be precise, because the reflexive response is predictable. Of course, people go there. Research stations operate year-round. Tourists visit in supervised groups. And that is true, but the Antarctic Treaty System, signed in 1959, now ratified by over 50 nations, designates the continent as a scientific preserve. It prohibits military operations, mineral extraction, and nuclear testing. In practical terms, it means that independent, unsupervised exploration of the Antarctic interior is functionally impossible. Not technically illegal, just unreachable. The logistical requirements demand government or institutional backing. The permissions are quietly restrictive. The infrastructure for independent travel simply does not exist. The result is straightforward. Antarctica is the one place on Earth where an ordinary person cannot simply go and look around. And I want to ask, when did we decide that was normal? Every other landmass on this planet is accessible to a determined individual with sufficient resources. People summit the highest peaks recreationally. People cross the most hostile deserts alone. People sail small boats to the most remote islands on Earth. But Antarctica has a treaty, signed by 50 nations in the very same decade that sonar first confirmed what lay hidden beneath the ice. And no one finds this remarkable. We nod. We accept the explanation: science, peace, environmental protection. And maybe those motivations are genuine, but the historical record shows that global consensus of this magnitude is extraordinarily rare. Nations disagree about everything: borders, resources, ideology, language. The 20th century was essentially defined by that disagreement. Except here. except about this one frozen continent that officially contains nothing of strategic value beyond ice and wildlife. What is it about ice and wildlife that requires the coordinated silence of 50 governments? Let me bring this back to architecture, because this is where the Tartaria connection steps out of the abstract and into the physical. Across this series, we have documented, imperfectly, provisionally, but documented, the appearance of old-world construction methods in locations where they have no plausible origin. Structures that materialize in the historical record fully complete, with no trace of the decades-long construction process they would have required. Civic infrastructure in cities officially founded in the early 1800s that exceeds what those young settlements could have conceivably produced. Cathedrals in frontier towns, sophisticated drainage systems beneath cities that were, according to the official timeline, untouched wilderness 5 years prior, buried first floors. Windows that begin below modern street level, either because the ground rose or because something came down and covered what was already standing. This pattern is not isolated. It spans North America, Europe, Russia, South America. It is global. And each time it surfaces, the institutional response is the same: dismissal, or a vague gesture toward explanations that dissolve the moment you examine them with any rigor. The construction phases are absent. The labor force is unaccounted for. The supply chains that should have fed such projects leave no trace. The timelines collapse under their own arithmetic. Something was already built. Someone was there before. And now, Antarctica. The cartographic evidence establishes that at some point in historical time, not geological deep time, but historical human-scale time, Antarctica was ice-free and habitable. Habitable enough to be observed, habitable enough to be mapped, habitable enough that those maps survived into the 16th century, preserved from even older originals. What stood on that continent? What exists right now beneath 2 miles of ice? I am not claiming hidden pyramids under the ice sheet, though geometric formations in the Ellsworth Mountains have generated genuine academic discussion about their origin. I'm not claiming a lost city beneath the Ross ice shelf. I am asking something far simpler, and, I think, far more disturbing. Why don't we know? In an era of ground-penetrating radar capable of imaging geological structures thousands of meters below the surface, in an age when satellites can resolve objects the size of a dinner plate from orbit, why does high-resolution mapping of Antarctica's subglacial topography remain incomplete? Why do the data gaps cluster in the interior? Why, with all the technological power of the most advanced civilization in recorded history aimed at every corner of this planet, does the silence over that continent persist? And the silence, once you begin listening for it, is everywhere in this story. The Piri Reis map receives no serious discussion in standard curricula, a footnote at best, if it appears at all. The simultaneous arrival of 3 independent expeditions in 1820 prompts no institutional curiosity about coordination. The gap between ice-free maps of the 1500s and the frozen wasteland officially discovered in the 1800s generates no sustained inquiry into how ancient cartographers could depict subglacial terrain in an era centuries before the technology to verify it. Silence of that scope across that many disciplines, sustained for that many decades, that is not merely the absence of interest. That is a structure. It has edges. It has a shape, and that shape implies something beneath it. I will not tell you what it implies. I think you can feel it already. Let me close with what has been turning in my mind since I first began pulling this thread. If we accept, provisionally, carefully, with every appropriate grain of skepticism, that prior to the 19th century there existed a worldwide civilization of remarkable sophistication, if we accept that this civilization produced the infrastructure, the maps, the architectural knowledge that our official history cannot coherently explain, If we accept that the events of 1816 represented, in some form, the violent terminal convulsion of that civilization, a collapse so absolute that it scarred the atmosphere across an entire hemisphere. And if we accept that Antarctica, the last unmapped ice-free landmass visible on those older charts, was sealed, frozen, treaty-locked, and quietly placed beyond public reach in the years and decades that followed, then one question remains, the hardest one. What were they protecting? Not necessarily from us, perhaps from time, perhaps from disorder, perhaps from the kind of unregulated, uncontrolled discovery that would inevitably follow if anyone with a ship and a question could sail south and start digging. What knowledge is stored there? What records? What built structures? What physical proof of a civilization that we have been prevented from knowing through some combination of catastrophe, deliberate erasure, and generations of institutional indifference? I do not have the answer. I want to be honest about that. These questions have lived with me for months, and they have not resolved. They have deepened. Every layer of the record I peel back reveals not clarity, but architecture, the outline of something deliberately concealed, something whose contours I can trace without ever seeing its face. And once you perceive that architecture, you cannot make yourself unsee it. An atmospheric catastrophe in 1816, unmatched in scope. A continent officially discovered 4 years later by 3 nations simultaneously. That continent sealed by international treaty a century after that. Ancient maps depicting what lies beneath its ice. A historical record that falls silent at precisely the moments where continuity should exist. Structures without builders, cities without origins, a civilization without a headstone. And a continent, renamed, restricted, ice-covered, and held just beyond our reach, that may contain, beneath 2 miles of frozen silence, the answer to everything. Maybe, maybe not. But I cannot stop returning to that number, 1820. And I do not think you will be able to either. If this series means something to you, leave your thoughts or your own theories in the comments below. The next episode takes this somewhere I wasn't certain I was ready to go. I think I am now. See you there. See